This is Beyond the Resume, the podcast that brings you the stories, advice, and insights behind some of the most successful people in real estate. Beyond the Resume is brought to you by Jackson Lucas Executive Search, the industry leader in human capital solutions. Here is Chris Papa.
And welcome to this webinar where we will discuss some, current issues in DC affordable housing and potential solutions. So I think we'll just kick it off with introductions. I'm Kristin Niver. I'm a commercial real estate attorney at the law firm of Robinson Cole with a career-long focus on affordable housing transactions. Prior to becoming an attorney, I was an urban planner with a focus on affordable housing policy, and I've done pretty much everything in the affordable housing space, from syndicator representation to lender work to developer side work. So I'm very excited to be here and to welcome this wonderful group of panelists. So I think I'll start with Kate, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kate Owens. I'm the Vice President of Investments at Jair Lynch. I've been there about 2 years, and we have a mix of largely multifamily properties across the DMV and throughout the Southeast. And I'm excited to talk to you guys today.
And Kimberly?
Great. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Kimberly Driggins. I'm the CEO of the Washington Housing Conservancy. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we operate in the District, Maryland, and Virginia area. We're relatively new, not-for-profit. We were created to really focus on preservation of market rate affordable, or NOAA housing. And my career has been in urban planning and development, worked for the city of, for DC and for the city of Detroit.
Great. Mitch?
Hey everybody, my name is Mitch Crispell. I'm a director of real estate development here at True Ground Housing Partners. We own about 2,800 apartments in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and we have 1,300 under construction today and more in the pipeline. And I have a focus on DC as part of my role. And previous to this, I worked for Bridge Housing in San Francisco.
Great. And Ed?
Hi, everyone. Ed Delany, Senior Director, Capital and Community Finance. For the last 15 years, I've had the pleasure of leading the debt and equity originations for Capital One in the Mid-Atlantic, and have recently let a few people know, but I'm coming out right now, that I'm retiring at the end of the year. And
Oh.
brought in someone whom many of you may know, Stephanie Pierre-Louis, most recently from NEF, is taking over the Mid-Atlantic market. So we're working together to assure a smooth transition, and I'll still be around in this space coming to things like this. You not have a little bit of FOMO, can't quite let it go, but just thought I'd share that news here a little more broadly.
Well, we're so lucky to have you for this. I'm so glad. So the webinar was marketed as Fixing the Formula in DC Affordable Housing, but it could be more aptly called Beyond the Rental Act, because as some participants might know, on September 17th, the DC Council passed what is known as the 2025 Rental Act, standing for Rebalancing Expectations for Neighbors, Tenants, and Landlords. And it was intended to attract housing investment back to DC. So this webinar is going to examine some of the key drivers and underlying conditions that led to the Rental Act, and the problems, pressures, and certain political dynamics that drove its creation and eventual adoption. And then we'll discuss where we should go from here. So the challenges that the bill aimed to address were really twofold. First, delinquency, economic vacancy, and challenges with landlord and tenant laws. And then second, TOPA, otherwise known as the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So first, we're going to dig into some of the landlord-tenant law issues, the first being delinquency. DC is suffering from rising rent delinquencies and financial strain on housing providers. And so I'd like to kick it over to Kate and Kimberly to kind of talk about, what's going on in DC with rising rent delinquencies and, how the Rental Act is trying to address those.
Want to go first, Kimberly? Want me to go?
Sorry, did you say for me to go first?
Do you want to go first?
Either one.
I'm happy to. Thanks, Kate.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that DC has always had some challenges, but since COVID and the pandemic, over $1 billion, that's B as in boy, $1 billion in rent has been lost to DC landlords since the pandemic. 15 to 25% of tenants remain delinquent, often owing up to $28,000 each. These are sort of really big numbers. The spike in rent delinquency really was due to some COVID era allowances that were aimed at keeping residents in place, but they never went away after the pandemic, the public health emergency was lifted. And so court delays, extended timelines, and the continuation of emergency era rules have left landlords unable to enforce leases and recover unpaid rent. Again, this multi-year losses have now exceeded $1 billion, and it's really leading to a destabilization of the city's affordable housing ecosystem. There are some differences between the affordable housing and market rate, but all are sort of suffering acutely in the affordable housing portfolio. Just some numbers, and I'm getting this from HAND, also known as Housing and, as well as the Coalition for Small Multifamily Owner Association. Their talking points are serving as a guide in some of the numbers that I'm about to share with you. Earlier this year, the DC Housing Finance Agency reported that its affordable housing portfolio required $143 million in immediate support to prevent forbearances. This figure is not the full rent loss. The DC HFA's distressed portfolio is 10% of the city's 180,000 rental units. Scaled, this is a considerable loss and delay. On the market-wide delinquency, affordable housing providers are reporting 5 to 25% of tenants remain delinquent. This is as of this summer. And the recovery in trying to get unpaid rent in DC, the eviction cases are taking twice the national average and 18 to 24 months to resolve. So with average rents of $1,000 to $1,200 a month, each delinquent household accrues about $18,000 to $28,000. So the issues here are severe. I'm going to pause here and have my colleague Kate jump in with anything else you'd like to add around the context.
Yeah, I mean, that was great, and I loved hearing all those numbers. I think it was important during the moment that with the COVID shock that we provide relief, and I think we saw it across the country. And one of the things that happened in DC that was sort of unique, I mean, other places have struggled too, was the rollback of those changes to kind of neutralize so that we didn't have the impacts. And I think for us, kind of very practically, to Kimberly's point, our affordable housing portfolio really does bear the brunt because rents are lower and our margins are so thin, right? So we've all seen expenses increase at the same time as suddenly we're seeing collections decrease. So one of the things that as we were preparing for this, I was reflecting on that this has all made me think about in a different way is, we used to just look at vacancy, and then you would think a little bit about economic vacancy, but there was never, our underwriting was always 1 to 2%, right? And that was normal. And that, Ed would be okay with that in a pro forma, I would send him. And Then now that what's changed and what's so different is that there's a big differential now between that physical vacancy and the economic vacancy. And at times, and that's grown dramatically for us. And in particular in our affordable housing portfolio, we've seen, it'll go from before the pandemic at 2-3% to 35 to 40%, which just makes it so it's pretty hard for real estate to work. It makes it difficult to pay an electrician. It makes it difficult to pay utilities. And so we've seen, colleagues across the DMV really start to crumble and start to struggle to provide the housing that, is this amazing contract that we've come up with to try to provide affordable housing. And I'll also say I've worked across the country, and one of the things I've always found remarkable about the district and the DMV is the ecosystem of actors here, how diverse it is, how many different tools DC has always had. Some places it's just nonprofits, some places, it's people are only looking at light tech new construction. Here you see the whole gamut. You see tons of support from the district for affordable housing. And what's so hard about what the Rental Act, this delinquency did, is it kind of undermined a lot of that progress and that depth of the ecosystem.
Oh, great. Would either of you like to talk about how these large amounts of unpaid rent sort of have a ripple effect on a landlord's ability to maintain properties, pay mortgages, and keep, operations going? And how this eventually probably led to there is a drop in building permit applications in DC, and kind of why this is a concerning trend.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start just by saying, I mean, it's simple economics, we're not getting the money to cover the operating expenses for the buildings. And so that's leading to a deterioration of the buildings itself. And it's also, it's creating an untenable environment for everyone, for residents themselves. It's the social contract in the district is broken around tenant and landlords, and many tenants are not paying their rent. Some are not able to pay, and there are resources available to help those tenants. But I will have to say that it's like when you have a lot of people not paying your rent, it's the good actor often will look at their neighbors not paying, the buildings deteriorating, and decide that they're not going to pay either. So you're getting a situation where the buildings are crumbling. We don't have the money to make the repairs. That's often used as an excuse in some instances not to pay rent. And it's just creating an environment, and then not able to pay the loans that are due. So you're seeing some go out of business. You have many that are thinking about selling their assets in DC, their portfolios, because of the delays in being able to recover the rent. So the deferred maintenance, I'll just say specifically, we have a couple of properties in the district, and we have one that, has high non-rent payment. And when you're not paying your rent, you're not likely to let the property management know that there's issues with your units. So when you actually turn over the unit, there's so much more that you have to do because the problems in the buildings and in the units have not been surfaced. And so, there's a lot of things that we don't even know until we're actually able to turn over the unit. And that's taking anywhere from 18 to 24 months on the eviction. So it is, it's a domino effect around sort of high non-rent payment that leads to buildings being in disrepair and not having the resources to actually put into the buildings. I would say everyone on this call, Mitch, Kate, we're not slumlords at all, but the buildings we don't have the money to put in for the CapEx plans that we've modeled for our buildings in particular. We're not even able to meet some of those obligations. So it really is sort of a situation where I understand where tenant advocates are on some level when they're criticizing the poor conditions of the buildings. That's true, but I think the other side of it is that, you know, we can't do the things that we don't have money for, and that's just the bottom line. So, you know, as you can see, I'm passionate about the issue. I will let Kate chime in with their experience with some of the properties.
One thing I think, to Kimberly's point about the advocacy, I think, you know, I fully understand. And I have this, it's an awkward feeling because you don't want to be able to easily evict people. You know, as a landlord, as an affordable housing advocate, is like, that's what I spent my career doing. But you're like, oddly, that's what I'm advocating for here. And that's strange. And part of, and so it's a very tenuous, tender space, right? When you start to talk about this. But the thing that I like to, that's counterintuitive at the same time, is that, as Kimberly mentioned, when our expenses are piling up and we don't have enough revenue, that means rents go up, right? That means that counterintuitively, instead of being able to cover, I have to somehow increase rents. Now, it's very difficult in LIHTC buildings to do that. In market rate buildings, that's what you're going to see, is rents just go up more. So it's strangely, in an attempt to try to provide more affordable housing and more relief, in some ways what we see is increasing rent growth, because landlords have no option but to say, if I'm going to lease this. And then the other thing that I think we've seen and we've had to adjust is our lease up process and our tenant review process is more rigorous. And we have to ask for more documentation, and we have to ask for more income. It makes it actually harder, and we're creating more barriers to entry for people to be able to find housing. And that is also not what we wanted. So to the unintended consequence, it's both, for me, makes it harder, and it's harder. That's bad for me too, right? Like, I don't want it to be hard to lease. I don't want to have to go through this. But because we've had so many issues, we've seen both, you know, more difficulty converting interest into leases, just because we have to change our process. And then also rents eventually in the district, have gone up as a result.
And we've also had those unintended consequences around strict our application process, as well as the other things that Kate mentioned. I will say, you know, I don't think anyone on this call is pro-eviction. I think it's really around certainty around the eviction process that, you know, we're really seeking, because the lack of consequences for not paying rent has actually just, you know, I think people that would normally sort of do the right thing are taking some liberties around the environment. And we absolutely have seen that, where, you know, we have a rent relief fund as an organization. We steer people to rent relief funds that are available by the city or with a CSU, which is a credit building platform. Again, my organization has a rent relief fund for those folks that are in the 31 to 60 day period. When you get beyond like 6 months, when you're talking 6 months to a year, it's almost impossible to get caught up. So, you know, we're not talking about, you know, you're 1 month or 2 months behind. We're actually actively working with those folks to try to keep them in their homes. It's actually when you get to a point of no return, and that's the issue that most of the affordable housing providers find ourselves in, and it's not great, and it's not sustainable for our business.
You know, if I could jump in here.
Yeah,
from
please. I was going to turn it over to you, Ed. Yeah, please go ahead.
I could think of 27 things to say just because of the things you said and how it impacts us and how we're trying to finance. And you know, you mentioned the bad actors. I have a customer who was telling me they just had somebody move in recently, and they borrowed something and they needed to bring it back to the management company the next morning. And when they brought it back, they also handed them a piece of paper and they said, yeah, about 5 o'clock after I had just finished, someone knocked on my door and they handed me this sheet of paper and it said 10 ways to not pay your rent. And that was one, my developer customer happened to be in the management company's office at the time and said, this is just so disheartening. You know, you're trying to bring in new tenants and they're not even there for 24 hours. And some of their neighbors are saying, you know, you don't need to pay the rent. You paid all you need to pay. First and last month's rent. That's it. And another one of my customers is saying that they've got some long-term people who haven't paid rent and, you know, up to years. And they have a program. They're trying to keep people in there. They said, they bring them in. They say, you pay a month's rent, we'll forgive a month's rent. You pay a month's rent, we'll forgive a month's rent. Any way to keep them going. But you know, that's one person at a time. We've noted that there's a national nonprofit developer who was, they noted that you probably read it in the Post. Their DC portfolio accounts for 75% of all their overdue rent. We have a customer we underwrote and we closed 2 transactions with them in 21, 22. And they had a significant amount of liquidity and net worth that met our guidelines for doing new transactions. And we were doing a deal that we've been tracking for a long time with them in another market, not DC. And, you know, frankly, they don't meet their liquidity and net worth covenants that they have with their other lenders. They have spent all of their money because, as Kimberly noted, we have such thin margins in this space. We're underwriting our transactions to a 115 debt cover. If you have a market rate transaction and some people aren't paying rent, well, then it's just a little less profitable of an investment. But when you're at 115 and people don't pay their rent and you go, and it's almost worse if you're at a 90% occupancy, but a 70% economic occupancy. It means you have to pay the expenses for the full building. You've got to heat the full building. You've got to do everything. And you don't have enough money to do that, much less pay your mortgage. So when you have repairs, it must be, I know it's very disturbing where, you know, you can't pay your mortgage in DC and yet another area of the city is knocking on your door saying, hey, you got to, you know, I'm getting complaints, you know, the heat's not on or this or that. And people are spending down all their liquidity. They're spending down all their assets just to keep the building going. And as you noted before, the rental contract, you rent the unit, we provide you housing, you pay us a rent. We're seeing it throughout our portfolio. We've got transactions that, you know, they're in the year 10. We're looking at them being, you know, on the back end of, the long side of a light tech transaction where, you know, the compliance period is winding down and, you know, this should be great. And, you know, rents have gone up, expenses have gone up, obviously over time. Insurance, we all know, has gone up, maybe a little higher than we pro forma. But you would expect these properties to be profitable, and instead they're skimming along at just above break even and sometimes below break. So obviously the impact for us as we're both lenders and investors in the district is extreme caution. We are seeing transactions from multiple customers who thought they had a deal with another lender. And that lender said, look, we're out. We're just not going to do anything in the district until things get fixed. So obviously the Rental Act is helpful, but it's going to take a while to turn the tide. And we've recently closed a couple of transactions in DC. We ourselves are being very, very cautious. We're looking at the strength of the developer. We're looking at that particular transaction, how long before we anticipate it'll be completed. It used to be, you know, the rehabs, we'd think, okay, well, we're going to have income right away. So maybe that's a safer bet. You know, we're weighing that versus new construction. A new construction deal that'll take 3 years to get built, hopefully, and hope's not the best strategy, but hopefully, you know, things will be fixed. So by the time we're leasing this building, we can actually expect the tenants who come in will be paying the rent and the deal will be profitable. Kristin, you look like you want to say something.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just going to say, you touched on the breakdown of the rental contract between tenants and landlords, and I was hoping maybe Kate and Kimberly could talk a little bit more about the eviction backlog in DC and specifically the ERAP program, what the ERAP program is and how the Rental Act tries to address it, and then just anything else they want to say about how these, how these eviction issues have disincentivized investment in housing in DC.
Yeah, I mean, I can take that. I think the ERAP, was an emergency rental protection, and I think we I think it's for very low income, and I think that is positive. And I think it's important. It's closed. Funding it remains sort of an issue. And I think for us, kind of more than the focus on ERAP, I think ERAP's been a little bit less of a tool for us recently. It's more kind of what Ed was starting to touch on is investors both in our market rate portfolio and probably for us and relevant to this conversation in our affordable portfolio are really tepid and need to see very, very, very strong deals, which, it's very hard to do when you have to underwrite, economic, delinquencies of 15% or something, right? So I think the interesting thing is going to be to watch how the DC Rental Act changes. And I think part of what we're going to talk about later is just sort of how that begins. It's a great first step, and like what work is left to do there. And I think that's exciting for us. I think we definitely hope to see on a couple properties in particular, a big turnaround in our affordable. Just in some ways, not that it fixes all the problems, but to the conversation we've been having about it being about individuals making choices to pay rent or not. And we're hoping that when, you start to see a few of the bad actors in some buildings that have, owe us a couple $100,000 in back rent, that when those people start to have some consequences from not doing that, we already are starting, I would say, because it's already working itself through, starting to see people come into our office and try to work out payment plans, which is pretty exciting. And I think that's in some ways one of the big turnarounds. And I think our vice president of asset management was like, we need to see. But I really believe it'll start to change things just from having some consequences. And I think we're already seeing that early change. And then it allows us to figure out a workout plan with someone and get them back on track.
Hey, and before Kimberly, maybe you jump in, I wanted to mention something else that Capital One's working on. And with some of our approaches for supportive services, rental services with our customers is a program called rent reporting. And what that does is the tenants can voluntarily opt into this, where there will be reporting to the credit unions of their consistent and on-time rental payment, because that's one of the things that has made it difficult for some people to ever move from rental to home ownership. As they say, I paid my rent on time for 4 years and I don't get any credit for this. And because I didn't buy a new car, I don't have actual, credit history. And, there's a little bit of a concern from people, well, what if I miss? Well, actually, guess what? People know if you haven't paid your rent, that's reported. But this rental reporting is a positive thing, and it can maybe help, and Mitch, it'd be great for you to let us know about how it looks to you all too, because I know True Ground does a lot with your tenant and supportive services, but to say, hey, if you're already somebody who would have been paying your rent, if you do pay your rent, you opt into this. This is something that can help you in your long-term financial goals. And it can help build back that idea that you sign a lease, you pay your rent, this is what you do, and you're going to be rewarded for it, rather than feel like, oh, well, no one else is paying their rent, why should I? And, these are the little steps that we can all make. And, we're trying to help here, but so it's a new program for us. We'd love to hear how it resonates with property owners.
Well, yeah, the program we use is called Isusu, and if you opt in, it's only positive credit reporting. So if you pay your rent on time, it reports it to the credit agencies, and if you don't, it doesn't do anything, because there's already plenty of ways that non-payment of rent goes to credit agencies, as you mentioned. So yeah, And then there's also a bunch of other like mini loans and incentive programs within the platform. But the fundamental thing is to have people's, on-time rent payments go toward their credit history. And we're having a lot of success with that in our portfolio.
Yeah, I think I can really mention DCU too. We also, all of us, I think it's become an industry standard, which is great. It's been wonderful, I think, for a lot of our tenants.
Yeah, I'm hoping Mitch can talk about TrueGround's experience in Virginia and how Virginia differs and how Arlington and other jurisdictions in Virginia have avoided some of these issues and why.
Definitely. So we only have just under 100 of our 2,800 apartments in DC. So we don't have the same level of concerns that you've been hearing from Kate and Kimberly. But we managed to keep our our eviction rate below 2% across our entire portfolio. And it's really three things that make that possible. The first is our resident services team. We have a 25-person team that's one person at every single property, meeting with tenants, getting to know them, planning programs, and providing referrals for extra services that they may need. There's actually a lot of financial assistance available, and people don't know about it. So the services coordinators help residents to find that assistance. They're also there with the relationships already built, so that if a tenant does fall behind on rent, they already know them and they can, help intervene. And the second piece is a functional courts process. In Arlington, there's just not the same regulatory challenges that DC has. They didn't pass all those same things during COVID, or if they did, they've been repealed, right? So every month we get a report from our property management agents of everybody who's behind and who they plan to file on. And we say, okay, go ahead and file. And then concurrently, we give that list to our resident services team and say, please go reach out to all of these people to try to figure out what's going on, connect them to resources. Sometimes if people can get help with childcare, if they can take that expense off their books, then they can use that money to pay rent, for example, or there's a million other examples like that. And then the third piece is funding from the jurisdictions. So Arlington has a program that gives up to $3,000 per year to families that can prove that if they get that money to become current on rent, they'll be able to sustainably pay rent going forward. This is similar to the emergency rental assistance program that DC has. It's just that it works better. It's available all year. It doesn't run out in hours or weeks like it does in DC. And it's just a more functional system. And then, again, these things are happening concurrently. We file for eviction, we pursue that in the courts, but all the way up until the moment the sheriff arrives to perform the eviction, if a tenant can, catch up on their balance and make themselves whole, we will cancel the eviction, which is different than some developers. So I think it's that three-part strategy that allows us to keep our eviction rate below 2%. And in DC, you're missing two of the three, right? We have a resident services coordinator on our DC property, but we don't have the functional regulatory environment, and we don't have steady, reliable financial assistance available to help people get current on rent.
I'll just add, we have a large portfolio in Virginia as well. And similarly, our eviction rate is below 2%. And we have there's just a lot more tools, and the process is functional. The courts, are working in Virginia, where I think, coming back to what Rental Act 2.0 looks like, I think there should, we can talk about that and get into the details, but I think it's really about this kind of processing time and some of the things that are still left to do in the district.
Yeah, I agree with Mitch and Kate. But I would just offer a friendly adjustment. I actually do think the district has funds available. I think it's that people are so far behind in their rent, right? So the district actually has, it has been funded, the emergency rental assistance program. I think it's a direct result of the system not working around evictions and the backlog that creates this outsides need. And quite frankly, the emergency rental assistance was never created to, pay for people who owe, thousands of dollars, like 18, 20,000. You're never going to get out from under. It's only going to go to a few people if you use the emergency rental assistance for those cases. So I would say that the district's issues really are around the delays in the court system, the self-attestation that was definitely something that the that the Rental Act actually eliminated, and then sort of the judge's discretion around whether to move forward or kick the case back. So there's a lot around the courts. I think the timeline is elongated. There's not enough judges. There's vacancies, and for folks who are not in the DMV that are on this call, the judicial system, the judges are appointed by the feds, right? The district does not appoint its own judges, and so there are vacancies, and that's something that the district itself doesn't have any control over, around the speed in which we can fill the vacancies for the judges. So it's
I heard it was like 14 vacancies on the court or something, a huge number.
That sounds about right. I don't have the exact number. Maybe my colleagues do, but it's a significant shortage of judges. And, it's really the process. If the process and the certainty were in the district, I think you'd see it mirror more what you're seeing in Maryland and Virginia. Because, we have resources, and they're national resources for rent relief as well, that we actively try to encourage residents to go after. But, I think it's tough when you get above a certain amount that you owe.
Yeah, before we wrap up sort of the eviction question, I was wondering if Kate could talk a little bit about investor interest in DC and kind of what we've seen as far as a pullback, and how these eviction issues and other issues kind of play into that sort of retreat of investor interest in DC. And anyone else that wants to jump in?
Yeah, I think obviously I'm going to pass the Mike eventually to Ed on this one, but I think he started to highlight sort of what we've seen. We've really seen a chilling effect across all types of real estate in all types of multifamily real estate. There's a million things happening in the world today that are leading to that, but in particular, we've seen, because of what I talked about, this differential between physical and economic vacancy, there's just a lot of tepidness to get into new deals. I think Ed may have mentioned, I don't know, we talked to a ton of investors like, hey, I've got a lot of workouts already in DC. I've got a lot of stuff that's super marginal. It's hard for me to want to take on more. I think some of the changes in CRA and some of the rules around where things need to be and the region and what happens regionally has meant that especially in LIHTC, equity is much more interested in Northern Virginia today than the district as a result of this. And so because there's not quite as close a tie to needing to be inside the district per se, there's also fewer originations in the district. So everything is sort of leading towards strength in places to the things Kimberly and Mitch just talked about, where it's the processes are working better. That's where people are going to see investors go. So we've seen just a real pullback. And I think you can see that. And I think everybody in DC knows, they just met a lot fewer closings this year, and not sure when it's going to fully start up next year. We have a couple of deals where we're sort of like, we thought we would be closing this year. Maybe it's going to be 27. And, that's just more deferred maintenance. That's more buildings that aren't great and just increasing what you have to do in the future. So I think, especially for LIHTC, it's a strange and difficult moment with a pause. And like I said, it's not as if rents have been going down. So affordable housing is still an incredibly acute issue in the district. So we really made it difficult to add or to maintain the existing affordable housing we have. And Ed, what do you want? You correct me or tell me what I said wrong.
Correct you. Everything you said is bang on. No, not every bank looks at it the same way, but for CRA, you touched on CRA.
Yeah.
Our assessment areas that we look at, individual and then metropolitan MSAs, where we need to invest, it just so happens for us, for equity, it includes our DC assessment includes Northern Virginia and Prince George's County and Charles County, Maryland. In addition to DC, for debt, it's actually, right now, we segregate that a little bit. We have the Virginia debt side, and we have, and this could change because they do it to us every year. But for debt, it's Montgomery, it's Prince George's County, and it's Charles County. I'm actually looking at, for 26, a bunch of deals in Prince George's County where I haven't done things a lot. And, it's right, and some of them are literally, half a mile from some of the properties in DC, but it's a completely different state. It's a completely different program. And you don't have all of the same issues that we've had. One of the things we look at very carefully, and we are going to look at for any of these new investments, is we're really going to look at the rigor, and you mentioned this, Kate, that you're going to impose for your renting, for your property managers, and to get people in the door. And we're also carefully looking at absorption, because a transaction we underwrote a year ago that said you'd absorb 24 units a month, we're seeing 12 units a month. And what's even worse is it's slower, but we want to make sure that these tenants aren't just coming across the county line from DC where they haven't paid rent for 12 months. We want to make sure you're not going to get somebody else in the door who then isn't going to pay rent. So that even makes doing something across the river in Virginia or across the line in Prince George's County or Montgomery County difficult for us to do. So everything is getting a little more difficult because we're all worried about the impact of DC. But the bottom line is we're very, very careful in anything we're going to do in the district. We're looking at transactions, and just like you, we're thinking maybe this is a 27 transaction, not a 26 transaction. Let's see how the rental act works. Let's see how people can stabilize their existing portfolios before we put another building up. And I think that was one of the better things done out of the rental act. Instead of taking the housing production trust fund money, say, okay, let's do another 36,000 units. Well, why not fix the 30? Am I jumping ahead? Why not fix the 36,000 units that you just spent money on, rather than try to do a few more and just create more vacancies? So.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn the conversation now to TOPA, or the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is another sort of layer of the DC housing ecosystem's complexity. So I would like Mitch to just talk a little bit about what TOPA is, why it's unique to DC, and how it helps or hurts the production of affordable housing.
Absolutely. So in a previous life, I was a tenant rights advocate, and I worked at one of the community-based organizations that implements TOPA, that goes around when tenants get their offers of sale and educates tenants and walks them through the process. So I've seen this from the tenant perspective and now from the developer perspective. So the TOPA law went into place in 1980 after a period of displacement and gentrification in parts of the city. And what it requires is that before a property owner of housing can sell their property, they have to offer it to the tenants to purchase it collectively as a group. And there's set timelines in terms of when they have to give notices and how long tenants have to respond. And it adds many months to a closing because you have to wait for the tenants' periods to expire before you can close. And another key detail is the tenants must match whatever price you work out with your buyer. This is pretty different from really anywhere else. Other places might have a right of first refusal, or the county has a right to buy buildings when they're for sale, but almost nowhere else has a policy where tenants can organize and control what happens to their buildings. There was a study written last year that studied TOPA since 2006, and it had some interesting findings. So in about half of the buildings where tenants had TOPA rights, the tenants did file Form to TA and successfully purchased them themselves in a very small percent of cases, or most of the time assigned their right of purchase to another developer. That's another thing you can do under TOPA, is assign your right of purchase and say, I don't want, Jair Lynch to buy my building. I prefer for WHC to buy my building, just using the names of the folks on the call. So 16,000 units since 2006 have been developed as affordable or preserved as affordable because of TOPA. and many other tenants have secured buyouts or improvements to housing conditions under TOPA. Most of the TAs that filed for TOPA were in older buildings, which was kind of the justification for this new 15-year exemption being not much of a hit to tenant rights that we'll talk about. And then on average, it took 5 months longer than if tenants had not filed for TOPA rights for buildings to transact under TOPA. So those are kind of some of the wins, and people argue about what the intentions of the law were. Is it to create affordability or to give tenants a seat at the table and kind of advocate for themselves and control their own destiny? There's also cases where I think that my opinion is that the law has not served its goals, and I'll give 2 examples. So just recently in the Washington City paper, there was an article about a deal in Columbia Heights where it was an affordable developer that owned it. They had planned for years to do renovation. They had gotten tax credits, bond authority, and TOPA was triggered. They were ready to do this big rehab and keep the building affordable. But TOPA was triggered because they were changing out the investors and selling to a new entity, which is often required when you're resyndicating tax credits. And the tenants organized, and another developer came in and promised them a lot. And the tenants picked them and assigned the rights to them. And it's so today, that was a few years ago. Today, it's still affordable, but no repairs have been done, and the conditions in the building have vastly deteriorated, and the tenants are really disappointed in their outcome. So that's one case study. And then another is what happened to me and my organization, where we were under contract for a property in Ward 3, west of the park, kind of the wealthiest area of the city where there's the least affordable housing, right near a metro station. And we had proposed to make the building, which was just a market rate or rent control, naturally occurring affordable housing, if you will, into deed restricted affordable housing, means tested, income verified, all that. But another developer came in, and the tenants voted to go with them because they feared a change in culture in the building. That was the words they used, which to me is reminiscent of the kind of NIMBYism that we see when we're trying to do new construction, the fear of low-income people living in their neighborhood, or in this case, as their actual neighbors in their building. To me, that's a pretty disappointing outcome because we lost out on the chance to have 200 plus units of affordable housing west of the park in this really high opportunity area. So the Rental Act did fix the first example I gave, but there was a proposal for it to fix the second example and provide a buyer side exemption. If you're proposing to make the building affordable, you'd be exempt from TOPA. That was proposed but did not pass. So that's a little background on TOPA, the good and the bad.
I want to just open it up, I think, to Ed, Kate, and Kimberly to kind of jump in on TOPA challenges, how it differs with market rate transactions, and then to Ed, kind of from the lender investor side, what he's seen with TOPA.
Yeah. I want to just take one moment, though, to talk about the Rental Act, which addressed both TOPA and our delinquency
Yeah,
issues.
please.
Just to sort of take a knee and say what happened is remarkable on the one hand, because it was a true coalition that came together. A lot of organizations put in a lot of amazing time and advocacy. DCBA, ERAP, DC Policy Center, Opportunity DC, Kimberly, all kinds of people came to the table and got together to provide all the evidence that we've all been able to talk to you about today in a way that is pretty remarkable, and created a coalition that we haven't seen. And speaking to that thing that I talked about at the beginning of like this ecosystem, it showed up right in DC in a way that got this policy through. And we're all talking about some of the shortcomings, but it is just that in and of itself is an exciting moment for DC, for us, because this was really the community. And I think our organization as developer, it wasn't all just our talking points, right? This was a community talking points and talking about this idea of affordable housing and multifamily housing in the district. So I do think it's really important to just to say that, and then also note like that coalition needs to stick together to keep working on it. Like, unfortunately, policymaking is not a one-shot deal. So we have to keep working, and there's more to come. So I think, and getting to TOPA, it's again comes from a wonderful idea and a place that we can all celebrate together, and it's just in the implementation. And I think The Rental Act fixed several things. I think the 15-year exemption is a big win. I think some of the small landlord things are big wins. I think on the affordable side, the length is a little more difficult for us. I think we had, as a C of O, so we have a property that had a C of O this would have worked for us because we ended up in multi-year delays, millions of dollars in lawsuits, and overextended on loans because of TOPA. Right. And it wasn't a sort of valid case necessarily, or not valid. It was just extended the process, and sort of the financing we would have had got kind of ruined by that process. We have another, and so the fixes to TOPA would have allowed that not to happen. We have another example where we were acquiring an existing property, and the TOPA process, to what Mitch described, the tenants association. And again, this is an interesting COVID era thing where there was an online attendance at tenants association meetings and a bunch of votes that were very difficult to trace. They weren't in person. I don't think it would have been one of those things where you can't tell what is a tenant association. I think that's what we have to continue to define a little bit clearer. What is a tenant? What is a tenants association? How do we make sure that these are really valid to what Mitch was advocating for in previous roles, that it's those tenant communities and not people delaying the process or another developer undercutting one another. So those kinds of things have happened and happened to us. And so this deal the closing got extended for 2 years. And in that time, millions of dollars were lost. And we've had all kinds of backlogs. We had all kinds of backlogs of the HFA and DC. So that deal remains unrenovated, and we're not able to meet our commitment to the tenants because of TOPA, right? Like TOPA extended us and put us in a pretty difficult situation. So I think again, hats off to what the community has done, but more to do. So Kimberly, what do you have to say?
Yeah, Kimberly and Ed, I'd like you both to kind of chime in. Kimberly, yeah, I'd love for you to talk about, your advocacy efforts around TOPA. What's next? Anything you want to say?
Yeah, no, appreciate it. And do want to try to leave some time for the questions if they're coming in. So I echo, what Kate said around the community coming together. I think, I think what the mayor proposed was really bold. I think Councilmember White also proposed some really great things. What actually got passed, there was like the version that the mayor submitted, and then there was what Councilmember White submitted, and then there was actually what was voted on. And they actually all are very different. And so, actually what passed, I think that the clear winner here is around reforms to the eviction process, where there's shortened timelines, there's the mandatory protective orders, and, not to get too in the weeds, but, prior to the Rental Act passing a couple of weeks ago, tenants weren't required to pay rent into the registry, right? Like if you're going through the court case, that's actually pretty huge, because that actually, having tenants continue to pay to this registry, mandatory protective orders, where tenants must pay acquired rent into a court registry while cases are pending. That's a huge, that's normal, right? Anywhere else in the country, that's what you do. That's not what was happening in the district. So the fact that that actually passed is a big win. The mandatory hearing deadlines for those to have been shortened, that's a big win. And so I'm less optimistic on the things that were passed around TOPA. I think that we tinkered around the margins. I'm not sure that it's going to change the investment picture. And this might be a good opportunity for Ed to come in. DC, even prior to COVID, DC lacked behind its peers, Maryland and Virginia, around multifamily sales investment. It was always a lagger, largely because of TOPA, the transactional cost for TOPA. It just sort of So COVID and what happened after COVID just depressed a market that was already a bit hard. There was definitely still sales transactions. I'm not saying that there weren't transactions. There definitely were. But now I don't think that the changes that have been implemented are going to do too much around that. They're certainly not going to, the changes are not going to move the needle around preservation, which honestly, preservation is cheaper and quicker than new construction. So the exemption, the buyer exemption that Mitch mentioned, would have actually created affordability at no cost to the district. Yes, there would have been or foregoing of tenant rights, but I would submit that preserving affordability is the name of the game, especially when you have rents rising because of all the things that have been discussed. So, I think it's a mixed bag. I do think it was a Herculean effort and everybody was rowing in the same direction and the community came together. I do think, there's more work to do. And I think that time will tell. And they've also made some changes around TOPA by making the definition of tenant a little bit more nebulous. There's some things that actually got added last minute that we don't actually know how that's going to play out with respect to TOPA. Time will tell. I'm not sure if it's positive. So I'm going to pause here because I know we're kind of bumping up against time.
Yeah, maybe Ed, if you have any final thoughts, and then I guess anyone else wrap up. And I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to say
there's
Yeah.
I have one question here from someone.
Okay.
So,
Okay, sure.
but
You want to go ahead, Ed, or
First,
maybe-
okay.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to say, I just realized I only put it in for the host, but Kate, I appreciated your glass half full acknowledgement of the rental act. There's progress. But we have to keep going. So for TOPA, I'll just lightning round here. I have financed a number of properties that went through TOPA where tenants got their rights. They assigned them to a nonprofit. Almost all of them were nonprofits. A couple were for-profits, and they redeveloped them as affordable housing, and they were successful and they were great. But I have a development group who acquired portfolio properties that had deteriorated. They had been highly encouraged by the district to buy these properties, and they always had the plan to renovate them, resyndicate them, and put them together into essentially two groups. And the 2 years in a row, they failed to get financing because of some changes in how the district had put together their qualifications for rehabs. Their programs were more geared toward new construction. So after a few years of just really struggling to get financing, they said, we're just going to have to sell them. But because they'd already been through the sales process, these tenants were activated. They knew about TOPA. So they exercised their TOPA rights in two different tranches, and they found someone to buy them. And it went through a period of time. And because of the increases in interest rates and everything else, both of those sales failed. So the developer went back to do it again. And another period of time goes by. And without dragging it on, over several years of bleeding, because these properties were not fully occupied when they acquired them, the tenants aren't paying rent, they made the very difficult decision that the only way out of TOPA under the old law was bankruptcy. And they put them into bankruptcy. And that process alone took years. And during all this period of time, they're just feeding these properties. So what was something that was highly encouraged by the city for them to help step in, proven developers, affordable developers with many, many years experience to help fix these properties, it just cost them millions and millions of dollars. And then on top of everything else, they have this little taint of bankruptcy hanging over their head is the only way out of what turned out to be a really bad 4-year experience that cost them millions. So it's TOPA still needs help in order for any type of long, meaningful investment to happen in the district.
Thanks, Ed. Chris, do you want to ask the one question to the panelists?
this is from Alicia Morgan. She's SVP at Property Management at Conifer. She says, what is the suggested road to recovery? Have we as an industry determined how to lobby for more judges or a faster court process? I see this as a 24-month process. Should we lobby for lowers or other offsets to taxes for the loss of revenue?
That's a question that I've been asked too by others. So I would love for the panelists to jump in on that if they have any thoughts. Kate, you looked like you did, or?
Well, I think in a moment when we have a very strong federal government, I think this is an appeal that we can make to this federal government to help. And it, as contrasting as some of the politics and stuff may be, I think getting the appointments of the judges is really critical. I think those vacancies, the numbers are pretty shocking for the decline in the ability to process evictions. Went from somewhere between 50 and 80 a day to 3 to 4 per judge. And there's just a part of that's vacancy, and part of that is process. But I think just fixing that and appealing to the federal, like Kimberly said, it's not something that the district itself can do something about, but I think that advocacy and pressure, and it appeals to this particular federal government. So that's one thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it for anybody else to close it out.
Yeah, I would be curious, Kimberly, was that part of the Rental Act conversation, or does that, just if you had any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was, but, again, we don't control the appointment of judges. So
Yeah.
I think that the Rental Act focused on what it could control. It definitely came up in like the working sessions with the council on the bill. I'd say the court reforms that will really help is kind of the speeding up the timeline for pre-filing notice period and the summons period, the increases to judicial discretion to not dismiss claims based on technicalities, simplifying required notice procedures, and what I've referenced earlier around requiring the court to issue preliminary protective orders for monthly rent to be paid into the court prior to any subsequent hearing. I think those court procedure reforms will vastly improve, well, maybe vastly is an overstatement, but it will improve the timeline for rent collections. And those are the things that were within the district's control to implement. So I can't really speak to the judge's issue. I do think Kate's correct that, if we have a line in to the federal government, and, I'm not quite sure how all that works to try to get those vacancies filled, that obviously would help as well. The path to that is a little less clear for me.
Yeah, and just to the last point of the question in terms of how can we make landlords whole and help them to, finance repairs and get back in the black. I think that last year the Housing Production Trust Fund went almost entirely to shoring up existing properties. And the round this year has not been released, but there's been some talk that it may do the same again. So that's, I think, where the city is putting money into it, the buildings versus like a tax abatement or other things that the questioner asked.
Their second part of the question was, do we lobby for, another part, I didn't mention this, do we lobby for fines to be waived, property physical deficiencies that cannot be addressed?
Yeah, there are slumlords, right, I think the housing conditions arena is not the part of the system that's broken, right? So that would be my take on that, is we need to fix the eviction and arrears problems and leave the housing conditions enforcement mechanisms alone.
Cool.
Well, this was great. Thank you to all the panelists. Chris, do you have any final remarks?
Oh, this is great. I mean, I didn't know much about this at all, so I learned a lot. So I was just another attendee here. So I appreciate everyone coming on here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
yeah,
for
thank you.
organizing us and hosting us.
Of course, yeah.
Got it.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Resume, a Jackson Lucas podcast where we take a deep dive into the career journeys of some of the top minds in real estate and equip you with the knowledge to move forward in your path towards the success you've envisioned. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Beyond the Resume. We're grateful for your support. All episodes of Beyond the Resume are brought to you by Jackson Lucas, building inclusive and diverse businesses through talent acquisition. Visit us at jacksonlucas.com